Hi, this is Counselor Fikowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at Units 3 through 7. This is not meant to be a comprehensive review, but this is meant to touch on the main ideas of each period. So looking in Period 3, the hallmark event that's really going to define this is really the aftermath of the French and Indian War, in which the colonists and the British are going to begin to split apart. Of course, we know the proclamation line of 1763 preventing westward expansion. We're also familiar, of course, with mercantilism. That's where we're going to be starting to see the taxes come about, thanks to the Navigation Acts, followed by the Stamp Act, Townshend Act, Tea Act, Coercive Acts, etc. It's important to note that these are important because this is going to lead to the colonies beginning to unify themselves. Certainly, we'll never achieve complete unity, but we are inching closer to that. And in addition, you have to look at the political causes here, certainly the Enlightenment with Thomas Paine with respect to common sense, and also that time period of salutary neglect right up to the French and Indian War, where the colonies were basically governing themselves. With that, we're going to see that ushering into the First Continental Congress, which is going to be looking at organizing resistance amongst the 13 colonies. There's your unity. We also, of course, see the Committees of Correspondence, and then eventually this will go into the Second Continental Congress, which will lead to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Now, once this war is declared, we're of course going to see this ill-prepared ragtag bunch of colonists forming the Continental Army. But it's important to note that they would not have won the war, most likely, without the assistance of the French. And here are some important battles here. I don't think you're going to be asked a particular battle on a DBQ, but certainly the biggest one, I think, in my opinion, that's going to be the most important is going to be the Battle of Saratoga, which is going to convince the French that, hey, yes, the Continental Army might have some muster in it, and as a result, we should side with them and stick it to the British. And certainly we're going to see General Lafayette, in particular from the French, going to be very, very helpful towards winning the Revolutionary War. Now, as I tell my own students, winning the Revolutionary War was the easy part. The difficult part here is devising a new form of government. And of course, we have the Articles of Confederation. They're going to fail. Too much power is given to the states. You have no national government for the most part. You have no figurehead. You have no court system. And Shays' Rebellion, of course, is going to exploit that. So the Founding Fathers are a little scared. They convene the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and that's where we're going to have the Connecticut Plan, better known as the Great Compromise. And we're going to have that where one House of Representatives and one Senate of equal representation. Of course, that's going to be based off of the New Jersey and Virginia plans. And then there you have your 3/5 compromise, sort of kicking slavery to the side. But of course, that's to keep the southern states with it. Now, we also are going to have the creation of the Bill of Rights to appease the anti-federalists who are very, weary of submitting to this new national government. And ultimately, they're going to sign on thanks to the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And one thing that's going to show that the Constitution, actually has some strength is, of course, we know the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, how should this new nation look? If you ask Hamilton, who was a staunch Federalist, there should be a national bank, loose interpreter of the Constitution, and this is going to contrast sharply to Jefferson, our third president, at this time saying, no, national bank. We should be a nation based on agriculture, and we should be focusing on state rights. And of course, he's a very big, strict interpreter of the Constitution. Now, of course, Washington is going to be our first president, and he's going to set precedents, past examples. He's going to very much exclaim the importance of neutrality, particularly in his farewell address, where he's going to advise against no political parties, watch out for sectionalism, avoid treaties unless commercial in nature, and isolationism is good. The problem is no really founding father or future president is really going to abide by that. Once you have Adams as our second president, you're going to see the rise of sectionalism between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, basically between the North and the South. Of course, Adams is going to have some unique events, from the XYZ affair to the first act of nullification, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions with respect to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which arguably went after Democratic Republicans. So certainly a lot in Period 3. Washington's farewell address is a great example for outside evidence. Now, when we look at Period 4, certainly the national government is trying to expand its powers. We see various Supreme Court cases here using these important powers that are going to grow the power of the national government. We'll also have Jefferson become the first Democratic Republican to become president, And it's not to say that while he was trying to implement a nation based on agriculture and be more state-oriented, some of his goals fell a little short. We also see one of the more controversial acts being the Embargo Act, which is going to be shutting down a lot of commerce, particularly in the North, and that was perhaps one of the unpopular events of his time. But of course, he's best known for the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Moving on to the War of 1812 under Madison, of course, this is once again going to split the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. You even have war hawks who are desiring a war with Britain, of course, out in the West and into present-day Canada. We even see that the Federalists are plotting to secede. That's how much they hate the Democratic Republicans, and this is plotted in the Hartford Convention. Of course, we know that this is going to reaffirm the independence of the United States. This is also going to make Andrew Jackson, our future president, in the Battle of New Orleans, quite a hero. Now, following the War of 1812, we'll have this time period known as the era of good feelings under Monroe, but really this is not a great time for the most part. It's very, very short. Sure, nationalism increases, but of course we're going to have increased sectionalism, we're going to have tariffs, we're even going to have the economic depression of 1819. There's that debate over the national bank, and of course, slavery. Now, when we go into Monroe, certainly a very important part is the Monroe Doctrine. Anything dealing with foreign policy, this is a great example of a document that you can synthesize back to on your DBQ. And as I mentioned before, sectionalism is growing. There are going to be attempts to stop this, and of course, Henry Clay, the American system, where he's going to introduce protective tariffs, national bank, and even putting forth internal improvements through subsidies. He's going to advocate that, but of course, really that's going to be a temporary fix. We also have our first slavery compromise with the Missouri Compromise. We even have the proposal under the Wilmot Proviso to basically banish slavery in future territories acquired by the United States. So a lot of this sectionalism is ramping up in period 4. It's also important to mention women's rights and slave rights. We're going to see certainly a lot of written publications, women in particular with the Declaration of Sentiments. They are going to convene in the Seneca Falls Convention. And then also with slavery, David Walker's Appeal, and of course Garrison's The Liberator. So we do see the tides of these rights of these particular groups beginning to gain some momentum. Now, in the mid to late 1820s, we'll have the rise of the common man under Andrew Jackson, who, of course, is going to utilize the presidency to benefit himself. Certainly, the first election was taken away from him, and that, of course, went to John Quincy Adams in what was known as the corrupt bargain. But certainly, once Jackson becomes president, he's going to basically reward his followers. He's also going to take aim at the tariff of abominations, and this is going to usher in the nullification crisis, where he's going to even threaten to hang his own vice presidents. He's also going to take aim at the national bank. He also sets up his pet banks, and we also know that he's going to try to deprive the national bank. And this is ultimately, with the help of the Specie Circular, is going to usher in a future panic under his predecessor, Van Buren. Now, because there's so much anti-Jackson sentiment, this is going to bring forth the Whig Party, which is strictly anti-Jackson. It's also important to note that during this time, he's going to ignore the Worcester v. Georgia ruling that's going to prohibit him to remove Native Americans. Of course, he's going to do that anyway under the Trail of Tears. But Van Buren will be the next president, basically ushering in many of his same policies. But because of depriving the national bank, for example, this is also going to lead to the Panic of 1837, which can arguably be traced back to many of these events. Also during this time period, we have the rise of manifest destiny, captivating the minds of Americans. The idea of moving west, a new start. Of course, the idea that God predestined Americans to expand from the east to the west coast. And we see this most well known with the Mexican-American War, which is going to increase the United States by about another third eventually. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, also we're going to have the side effects and the negative effects of Native American removal. So we see many issues with manifest destiny. All right, moving on to period 5, the rise of the Republican Party is going to come out, starting with its anti-slavery stance. This has ties to the Free Soil Party. Also, the idea of being anti-slavery and free soil is going to come up in the Lincoln-Douglas debates when Lincoln is running for Senate. We're also going to see sectionalism ramping up. You thought it was ramping up in the 1820s? Well, this is going to go even further. We see that with the Kansas-Nebraska Act because of popular sovereignty. You also see another Band-Aid attempt to stop the problems of the Compromise of 1850, with respect to slavery, but this is only going to ignite it, with the Fugitive Slave Act being very unpopular in the North, and of course popular sovereignty allowing future territories to decide their own fate. Well, that did not work out all that well with the Bleeding King. Now, when we look at John Brown, certainly that zealot moral crusader going after slavery and Harper's Ferry trying to lead a slave revolt, that will not work out all that well. And then, of course, we have the Dred Scott decision also showing that slaves are not counted or even seen as people. And then finally, with the election of 1860, this is going to be the biggest short-term cause, which will cause the South to secede because Lincoln is going to get elected. Now, early events in the Civil War are going to show that this is going to be anything but a short war. Remember that Lincoln's primary goal at this point is to preserve the Union. We see that the Confederate states are going to be under Jefferson Davis. We're also, of course, going to have those border states listed here. And really, Lincoln is in a very precarious position because he does not want to outlaw slavery in these areas because that would be a disaster for the Union Army, which needs all the support that it can get. But really, the Union's plan is, of course, a three-part plan known as the Anaconda Plan to slowly suffocate the South, versus the Confederate plan is basically just survive, play defense. Ultimately, both sides are going to utilize conscription, also known as the draft. This is going to be a long and a very, very deadly war. Now, the Battle of Antietam is going to be a big turning point in the Civil War, and of course Gettysburg, but I mention Antietam in particular because this is going to lead to the Emancipation Proclamation being read and being drafted. This creates a more moral purpose of the war, and this is also going to bring about the Confiscation Acts, where captured slaves are now considered contraband of the war and could be taken for the Union. So this is now changing the meaning and the trajectory of the war. The Union is going to utilize total war eventually to break the South. And with that, we see this particularly in Georgia. We're going to see with Sherman's March to the Sea. That's going to be very, very important. Now, since the Civil War has been over, it's a very, very bloody war with over 600,000 casualties. Reconstruction is even a bigger challenge. There are various plans at this point. Radical Republicans are the strongest and most punitive to the South. Lincoln's original plan prior to his assassination was known as the 10% plan. It was a very lenient plan, and Johnson is going to eventually try to carry this over, but Johnson is even more sympathetic. He's pardoning Confederates, and he's not all that sympathetic to the South. He's going to veto the Civil Rights Act. He's going to veto the Freedmen's Bureau Act. That, of course, is going to get overturned by the Radical Republicans, who are going to take charge, known with the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which is going to set up these military districts, and it's also going to require ratification of the 13th, 14th, and eventually the 15th Amendments. So it is important to note that there were some, very important legislative improvements. We see the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments coming about. We also see the Civil Rights Act of 1866 coming about. We see the Freedmen's Bureau, which is establishing schools trying to transition slaves from a life once of servitude to now one of getting out as a free citizen. And then you even have the first black U.S. Senator, Senator Revels, a very big monumental step. Now, Reconstruction, of course, has many setbacks. Of course, sharecropping and tenant farming, which was basically mirroring slavery. We also have the rise of the KKK once again. We even see that many Confederates who are going to take office again are pardoned under the 1872 Amnesty Act. And with all that, you're going to see the rise of Jim Crow laws, also known, of course, as black codes. So there's a lot of major problems with Reconstruction. I could certainly see a DBQ asking you to compare the advantages and disadvantages of Reconstruction. So we're going to stop right there, come over to the second video in which we'll review period 6 and 7.